London, 1845. The Delacroix ballroom glittered with the wealth of London's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast their golden light upon silk gowns and tailored evening coats, creating a kaleidoscope of color and movement that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the orchestra. For most young ladies, this was a chance to shine, to capture attention, and perhaps secure a husband before the season's end. For Miss Josephine Vance, however, it was merely another evening of acute discomfort. She stood against the wall, her pale blue gown blending with the damask wallpaper as though designed for that very purpose. Her chestnut hair was arranged simply, lacking the elaborate curls and ornaments that adorned the other young women's coiffures. In one hand, she clutched a dance card with not a single name inscribed upon it. In the other, she held a small notebook, wherein she had been surreptitiously sketching the various personalities that populated the ballroom. "Josephine, please put that away," her mother whispered sharply, appearing beside her with the silent grace of a woman accustomed to navigating society's treacherous waters. "What if someone should see? Drawing at a ball, it's most improper." Josephine tucked the notebook into her reticule with practiced speed. "No one notices me anyway, Mother. I'm quite invisible." Mrs. Vance's face softened momentarily. "Nonsense. You simply need to smile more, look more approachable. How do you expect to secure a husband if you're forever hiding behind books and drawings?" The familiar weight of disappointment settled in Josephine's chest. At 22, she was already considered firmly on the shelf by London's standards. This was her fourth season, and likely to be as unsuccessful as the previous three. "Perhaps I'm not meant for marriage," she said quietly. "Perhaps I'm meant for something else entirely." Her mother's eyes widened in horror. What could possibly be more important than making a good match? "Your father and I cannot support you forever, Josephine. And with your sister's dowry to consider now that she's coming out next year." The words hung between them, unfinished but perfectly understood. The Vance family's finances had never fully recovered from her father's ill-advised railway investments. They maintained the appearance of prosperity, but beneath the veneer of respectability lurked the spectre of debt. "I understand, Mother," Josephine replied, her gaze dropping to the polished floor. "I shall try harder." But as her mother moved away to converse with Lady Pembroke, Josephine knew that no amount of trying would transform her into the vivacious, charming creature that society demanded. She lacked both the beauty and the boldness required for success in the marriage market. What she possessed instead, a sharp mind, a talent for observation, and an imagination that refused to be constrained by drawing rooms and gossip, had no value in a world that measured a woman's worth by her ability to attract a husband. Across the room, surrounded by a cluster of admiring ladies, stood the newly returned Duke of Darrington. At 32, James Darrington had inherited the dukedom 3 years prior after his elder brother's unexpected death. Known for his intelligence and serious demeanor, he had been absent from London for nearly 2 years, attending to his estates, and it was rumored, nursing a broken heart after his engagement to Lady Caroline Whitmore had ended in scandal. His return to society had caused quite a stir, particularly among marriage-minded mammas with eligible daughters. A duke was always a prize worth pursuing, even one as reputedly cold and unapproachable as Darrington. Josephine observed him from her place against the wall. Unlike the other gentlemen, who preened and postured for the ladies' attention, the duke stood tall and composed, his dark evening attire impeccably tailored, but devoid of unnecessary embellishment. His face might have been carved from marble, handsome in a severe way, with a strong jawline and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She found herself reaching for her notebook again, fingers itching to capture the intriguing contrast he presented. Power and restraint, authority and isolation. There was a story there, she thought, one she would very much like to understand. "Miss Vance, I believe." The voice startled her from her reverie. Josephine looked up to find Lady Elena Rushworth standing before her, elegant in emerald silk, and wearing a kind smile that immediately put Josephine on her guard. Lady Elena was known for her charity work among London's unfortunates and for her matchmaking efforts among the ton's wallflowers. "Yes, Lady Rushworth," Josephine curtsied. "How do you do?" "Very well, thank you." The older woman settled beside her against the wall. I couldn't help but notice you've spent the entire evening in this exact spot. Heat crept into Josephine's cheeks. I prefer to observe, my lady. Indeed, and what have your observations yielded tonight? Josephine hesitated, uncertain whether the question was genuine or merely polite conversation. That people rarely show their true selves in ballrooms, she answered carefully. Everyone is playing a part. Lady Rushworth's eyebrows rose slightly, an astute observation. And what part are you playing, Miss Vance? The Wallflower, Josephine replied without thinking, then immediately regretted her candor. Forgive me, that was impertinent. But Lady Rushworth merely laughed, a warm sound that drew curious glances from nearby matrons. Not at all, honesty is refreshing in these circles. She leaned closer. And what of our returned Duke? What role does he play in your estimation? Josephine glanced toward the Duke of Darrington, who was now conversing with an elderly gentleman near the card-room entrance. The reluctant participant, she said softly. He observes as I do, but from a position that requires engagement rather than permits invisibility. Lady Rushworth studied her for a moment. You have unusual insight, Miss Vance. A rare quality. She straightened, adjusting her gloves with practiced grace. I host a small literary salon every Wednesday afternoon, nothing formal, just a gathering of minds who find stimulation in books and ideas rather than gossip and fashion. Perhaps you would consider joining us tomorrow. Josephine blinked in surprise. I would be honored, Lady Rushworth, thank you. Excellent, 2 o'clock, my card. She pressed a small visiting card into Josephine's hand. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I must rescue my nephew from the Featherington twins. As Lady Rushworth glided away, Josephine stared at the embossed card, a small flame of excitement kindling within her. A literary salon. A place where her mind might be valued rather than dismissed. A place where she might, perhaps, find others like herself. For the first time that evening, she smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her unremarkable features into something approaching loveliness. Perhaps there was a place for her in this world after all, even if it wasn't the one her mother envisioned. She did not notice the Duke's gaze lingering briefly upon that smile before returning to his conversation. The next afternoon found Josephine climbing the steps to Lady Rushworth's elegant townhouse in Mayfair, her heart beating a nervous tattoo against her ribs. She had told her mother she was attending a charitable committee meeting, knowing that Lady Rushworth's reputation for good works would make the excuse plausible. The small deception troubled her conscience, but the thought of explaining her actual destination and facing her mother's inevitable disappointment that it was not a marriage prospect that had prompted the invitation had stayed her tongue. The butler who admitted her took her pelisse and gloves with grave courtesy, then led her through the house to a bright, airy room at the back, overlooking a small but exquisitely maintained garden. Unlike the formal drawing rooms Josephine was accustomed to visiting, this one was arranged for comfort rather than display. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, comfortable chairs were grouped in conversational clusters, and a large table near the windows held journals, newspapers, and what appeared to be manuscripts in various stages of completion. 6 people were already present, engaged in animated discussion. Lady Rushworth rose immediately upon seeing her. Miss Vance, welcome. I'm so pleased you could join us. She beckoned Josephine forward. Allow me to introduce our little circle. Mrs. Helena Pemberton, the widow of Admiral Pemberton and a most accomplished poet. Mr. Thomas Fielding, who reviews for the Edinburgh Review. Miss Catherine Holloway, who translates from the Greek and Latin. Mr. William Barrett, who has just published a monograph on the architecture of ancient Thebes. And my nephew, Lord James Darrington. Josephine nearly stumbled as the Duke rose from his chair by the fire, his tall figure unmistakable even in the informal setting of a daylight gathering. He bowed with precise courtesy. Miss Vance and I are already acquainted by sight, if not by introduction, he said, his voice deep and measured. We were both at the Delacroix ball last evening. Though we did not speak, Josephine added, finding her voice. She curtsied, Your Grace. James, please, Lady Rushworth corrected gently. We dispense with formalities here. This is a place for minds to meet as equals. Indeed, the Duke agreed. though Josephine thought she detected a hint of reservation in his tone. "We are all simply seekers of knowledge in this room." "And what knowledge do you seek, Miss Vance?" This came from Mr. Fielding, a thin, scholarly man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose. Josephine hesitated, suddenly aware that she was among intellects far more educated and accomplished than her own. What could she possibly contribute to such a gathering? I am interested in understanding people," she said finally. "Their motivations, their secrets, the stories they tell themselves and others." "A student of human nature, Mr. Barrett nodded approvingly, "the most complex subject of all." "And do you record your observations?" Miss Holloway asked, leaning forward with interest. Josephine's hand instinctively went to her reticule where her notebook rested. "I sketch, and sometimes I write little stories based on what I observe." "Stories?" The Duke's eyebrows rose slightly. "Fiction?" "Yes," Josephine admitted, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "Nothing worthy of publication, of course, merely exercises of imagination." "I should very much like to read one of these exercises," Lady Rushworth said warmly. "I have always believed that fiction often reveals greater truths than so-called factual accounts." "Oh, I couldn't possibly," Josephine began, but was interrupted by Mrs. Pemberton. "Nonsense, child. We all share our work here, it's how we improve. Next week you shall bring something to read aloud, something short to begin with." The thought of reading her private imaginings aloud to this assembly, particularly with the Duke present, filled Josephine with terror. Yet beneath the fear lurked a dangerous, exhilarating spark of hope. These people, accomplished, intelligent people, were interested in her mind. "I shall try," she promised, taking the chair Miss Holloway indicated beside her. As the afternoon progressed, Josephine found herself drawn into conversations about literature, philosophy, politics, and art. To her surprise, her opinions were not dismissed but considered, sometimes challenged, but always with respect. She discovered a heady pleasure in being taken seriously, in having her thoughts valued not despite her gender and unmarried state, but without reference to those factors at all. The Duke spoke little, but when he did, his observations were incisive and thoughtful. Josephine noticed that he seemed most engaged when the discussion turned to practical matters, agricultural improvements, educational reforms, developments in medicine and science. His knowledge was broad and precise, his manner authoritative without being condescending. Occasionally, she felt his gaze upon her, evaluating, assessing. She wondered what he saw, just another unremarkable young woman pretending to intelligence beyond her station. Or perhaps something more. As the gathering began to disperse, Josephine found herself reluctant to leave. For a few precious hours, she had been more than a disappointing daughter or an overlooked wallflower. She had been a person of value, with thoughts worth hearing. "You will return next week?" Lady Rushworth asked as Josephine prepared to depart, "with a story to share." Josephine nodded, her courage faltering at the thought but her determination growing. "Yes, Lady Rushworth, I shall." "Elena, please," the older woman corrected with a smile. "As I said, we are all equals here." "Thank you, Elena." The name felt strange on her tongue, but not unpleasant. As the butler helped her with her pelisse, Josephine was startled to find the Duke beside her in the entrance hall, also preparing to leave. "May I offer you my carriage, Miss Vance?" he asked, his expression unreadable. "It would be no trouble to convey you home, before continuing to my own destination." "That's very kind, Your Grace, but unnecessary," Josephine replied, flustered by the unexpected offer. "I have my mother's maid waiting with a hackney." "As you wish." He hesitated, then added, "I found your contributions to the discussion most enlightening." Josephine searched his face for any sign of mockery or condescension, but found none. "Thank you, Your Grace. I enjoyed the afternoon immensely." "James," he corrected, the faintest hint of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. "If we are to be fellow seekers of knowledge, as my aunt would have it, perhaps we might dispense with formalities as she suggested." "I'm not certain that would be proper outside of Lady Rushworth's salon," Josephine said carefully. "Perhaps not," he conceded, "but I suspect propriety is not always the highest value in your estimation, Miss Vance." Before she could formulate a response to this unexpected observation, He bowed and stepped back. "Until next week, then." "Until next week, James," Josephine replied softly, testing the name as she had tested his aunt's. This time the smile reached his eyes, transforming his severe countenance into something altogether more approachable. It was gone in an instant, but the impression lingered as Josephine descended the steps to the waiting hackney. Something had shifted in her world, though she could not yet identify what it was or where it might lead. All she knew was that for the first time in years, she felt the stirring of possibility, a sense that perhaps her life need not follow the narrow path laid out for young women of her class and circumstances. She opened her notebook as the hackney jolted into motion and began to write. The week passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety for Josephine. By day, she attended to her usual duties, accompanying her mother on morning calls, helping her younger sister with her music practice, working on her needlework, all while her mind constantly returned to the story she was preparing for the salon. By night, she wrote feverishly by candlelight, filling page after page of her notebook, crossing out passages, rewriting scenes, developing characters based on her observations, but transformed by her imagination into beings with lives and emotions all their own. The story she finally selected was a brief tale about a young governess who discovers that her elderly employer is harboring a dangerous secret. Not, as she initially fears, a mad wife in the attic, but rather a Jewish family hiding from persecution. It explored themes of prejudice, courage, and the complexity of moral choices in a world that demanded simple answers. Josephine had no illusions about its literary merit, but it represented her best effort, and she had poured her heart into its creation. She copied it out in her neatest hand onto fresh paper, her fingers trembling slightly as she considered how it might be received. When Wednesday arrived, she dressed with particular care, selecting a gown of deep forest green that her mother had declared brought out the golden flecks in her hazel eyes. She arranged her hair simply but with attention to detail, securing it with her grandmother's silver combs, her only inheritance from that lady of literary inclinations, who had died when Josephine was just 8 years old. "You seem unusually interested in your appearance today," her mother remarked as Josephine prepared to leave for what Mrs. Vance still believed was a charitable committee meeting. "Has Lady Rushworth's nephew perhaps caught your attention?" Josephine's thoughts flew immediately to the Duke, but she quickly realized her mother was referring to some imagined young man associated with the fictional committee. "No, mother. I simply wish to present a respectable appearance." "Well, it's about time," Mrs. Vance said with satisfaction. "A little attention to your looks might work wonders for your prospects. Perhaps you'll meet some eligible gentlemen through this charitable work." Josephine merely smiled and kissed her mother's cheek, unwilling to either encourage false hope or reveal her deception. "I'll return by 5 o'clock." The salon was already in full swing when Josephine arrived, the participants engaged in a lively debate about a recent lecture at the Royal Society. She slipped into a chair near the edge of the group, clutching her manuscript and trying to steady her nerves. "Ah, Miss Vance," Lady Rushworth, Elena, she reminded herself, greeted her warmly. "We were just discussing Mr. Faraday's experiments with electromagnetism, but I believe you have brought something to share with us." All eyes turned to Josephine, including those of the Duke, who sat in the same chair by the fire he had occupied the previous week. His expression was one of polite interest, betraying neither expectation nor judgment. "Yes," Josephine said, her voice barely audible. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Yes, I have brought a short story, as requested." "Excellent," Elena declared. "We are eager to hear it, whenever you're ready, my dear." Josephine took a deep breath, unfolded her manuscript, and began to read. Her voice trembled at first, but as she lost herself in the story, it grew stronger and more confident. She forgot the impressive audience, forgot her own insecurities, and simply allowed the words to flow. When she finished, there was a moment of silence that stretched her nerves to the breaking point. Then Mrs. Pemberton spoke. "Well done, Miss Vance. A thoughtful exploration of a difficult subject." "Indeed, Mr. Fielding agreed, removing his spectacles to polish them thoughtfully. "Though perhaps the resolution is a bit too neat. Real moral dilemmas seldom resolve so tidily. I appreciated the governess's internal conflict, Miss Holloway added. Her struggle between convention and conscience felt authentic. The historical details were well researched, Mr. Barrett nodded approvingly. Though I question whether a country house in Yorkshire would have quite so many hidden passages. Josephine absorbed their comments with growing amazement. They were discussing her work as though it had merit, as though she were a real author whose choices and techniques deserved serious consideration. Your Grace, Elena prompted when the Duke remained silent. Your thoughts. James Darrington leaned forward, his gaze direct and penetrating as it met Josephine's. I find myself wondering why Miss Vance chose this particular story to share. A chill ran through Josephine. Had she somehow revealed too much of herself in her writing? Had he divined some hidden meaning she herself had not fully recognized? I'm not certain I understand the question, she said carefully. Of all the tales you might have crafted, you chose one about hidden identities, moral courage, and the conflict between societal expectations and personal conscience, the Duke elaborated. I'm curious about what drew you to these themes. The room seemed to hold its breath as Josephine considered her response. She could offer a bland, safe answer, that she had recently read about such matters in the newspaper perhaps, or that she simply found the historical setting appealing. Instead, she chose honesty. I believe we all hide aspects of ourselves from the world, she said slowly. We all maintain facades that allow us to navigate society safely. But there are moments when those facades become prisons rather than protections. Moments when we must decide whether comfort and conformity are worth the sacrifice of truth and principle. The Duke's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight softening around the eyes, a faint relaxation of the stern line of his mouth. And what would you sacrifice for principle, Miss Vance? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning she could not quite grasp. It felt both deeply personal and oddly public, as though the others in the room had momentarily faded from her awareness. I don't yet know, she answered truthfully. I have never been tested. But I hope I would have the courage to choose rightly when the moment came. For an instant, something like respect flickered in the Duke's gaze. Then he leaned back in his chair, and the moment passed. A thoughtfully considered response, he said. And a thoughtfully written story. You have talent, Miss Vance. The simple statement, delivered without embellishment or qualification, affected Josephine more deeply than all the other praise combined. She felt a flush of pleasure warm her cheeks. Thank you, James. The use of his given name drew a slight smile from the Duke and a look of pleased surprise from Elena. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Josephine remained acutely aware of the Duke's presence throughout the remainder of the afternoon. As the weeks passed, Josephine's Wednesdays at Elena's salon became the center around which the rest of her life revolved. Each week, she brought new stories or essays to share, each one a little bolder, a little more reflective of her true thoughts and feelings. And each week, she found herself both dreading and anticipating the Duke's incisive comments on her work. James Darrington was unlike any man she had ever encountered. He did not flatter or patronize her as most gentlemen did with unmarried ladies. Instead, he challenged her ideas, questioned her assumptions, and occasionally, when she had written something particularly perceptive or eloquent, offered the kind of genuine praise that made her heart skip a beat. She began to notice things about him, the way his brow furrowed when he was deep in thought, the rare but transformative quality of his smile, the elegant strength of his hands as they turned the pages of a book or gestured to emphasize a point in discussion. She found herself crafting arguments specifically designed to engage him, choosing topics she knew would provoke his interest or challenge his perspectives. It was a dangerous game, this intellectual courtship conducted under the guise of literary debate. Dangerous because Josephine knew, with increasing clarity, that what she felt for the Duke of Darrington had grown far beyond intellectual admiration. And dangerous because, despite his evident respect for her mind, she had no reason to believe he viewed her as anything more than an interesting conversationalist in his aunt's salon, a diversion perhaps, but certainly not a potential duchess. The truth of her situation was brought home to her painfully one afternoon in late April, when she arrived at Elena's townhouse to find the salon in an unusual state of excitement. Have you heard the news? Miss Holloway whispered as Josephine removed her bonnet. The Duke has finally decided to remarry. Lady Rushworth is ecstatic. Josephine's heart seemed to stop in her chest. Remarry. But the Duke has never been married. Not officially, no, but his engagement to Lady Caroline was as good as a marriage in the eyes of society. When she jilted him for that Italian count, everyone expected him to retreat from society permanently. The fact that he's now actively seeking a wife is the talk of London. I see, Josephine managed, though she felt as though the floor had suddenly tilted beneath her feet. And has he? Has he selected a particular lady for his attentions? Not yet, from what I gather, but Lady Rushworth has planned a house party at Darrington Hall next month. Apparently, all the most eligible young ladies of the ton will be there, along with their families. I expect he'll make his choice then. How sensible, Josephine said faintly. A ducal version of a cattle market. Miss Holloway laughed. Precisely, though I doubt the participants would appreciate the comparison. Throughout that afternoon's discussion, a debate about the merits of Gothic versus realist fiction, Josephine found it difficult to concentrate. The Duke was absent, attending to business in the city according to his aunt, and Josephine was simultaneously relieved and disappointed. She wasn't certain she could have maintained her composure in his presence after learning of his matrimonial intentions. It was foolish, she knew, to have allowed herself to develop feelings for a man so far above her in rank and consequence. The Duke of Darrington could have his pick of England's noblest daughters. Why would he look twice at a penniless wallflower whose only assets were a quick mind and a talent for spinning tales? As she prepared to leave, Elena drew her aside. "My dear, I have a proposition for you. I'm in need of a companion for the house party at Darrington Hall next month. Someone to help me manage the social aspects and keep me company during the inevitable hunting and fishing expeditions that will occupy the gentlemen. Would you consider accompanying me?" Josephine stared at her in disbelief. "Me? But surely you have relatives or friends more suited to such a role." "None whom I enjoy half so much as I enjoy you," Elena said warmly. "Besides, it would be a welcome change of scene for you, would it not? Darrington Hall is situated in the most beautiful part of Derbyshire. The library alone would keep you occupied for years." The thought of witnessing James select his future duchess from among the cream of society's beauties was almost unbearable. Yet the opportunity to see his ancestral home, to perhaps understand more of the man he was away from London's artificial constraints, was too tempting to resist. "I would be honored," Josephine said, knowing even as she accepted that she was walking willingly into heartbreak. "Excellent," Elena squeezed her hand. "We leave in 3 weeks' time. I'll send all the details to your mother. I'm sure she'll have no objection to your accompanying a respectable widow like myself." Indeed, Mrs. Vance had no objection whatsoever. When Josephine returned home and shared Lady Rushworth's invitation, her mother's reaction was one of unbridled enthusiasm. A house party at Darrington Hall, with the Duke himself in residence. "Oh, Josephine, this is beyond our wildest hopes. We must order you new gowns immediately. Nothing too showy, of course. You're going as a companion, not a participant in the marriage mart, but you must look presentable. Perhaps that pale blue silk we saw at Madame de Laporte's, and your grandmother's pearls would be appropriate, I think." "Mother," Josephine interrupted gently, "you do understand that I'm not being invited as a potential bride for the Duke. Lady Rushworth simply desires companionship during the house party." Mrs. Vance waved this away with a dismissive gesture. Of course, but one never knows what opportunities might arise. The Duke might see you in a different light, away from London's distractions, and even if his interest lies elsewhere, there will be other eligible gentlemen present. A house party offers so many chances for favorable impressions. Walks in the garden, musical evenings, even informal moments at breakfast when the ladies are at their most natural. Josephine didn't have the heart to contradict her mother's hopes, despite knowing their futility. Instead, she allowed herself to be swept into a flurry of preparation, fittings for new gowns, lessons in the latest dances from her more socially adept sister, endless discussions about proper etiquette for a ducal residence. Through it all, she nursed a private, painful awareness No amount of preparation could transform her into the kind of woman a duke would choose for his duchess. She was going to Darrington Hall as Elena's companion, nothing more. Any other expectation would lead only to disappointment. Yet deep in her heart, where dreams took root despite all rational objections, a tiny seed of hope refused to die. Perhaps, just perhaps, in the more intimate setting of a country house, away from society's constant scrutiny, something might shift between them. Not a declaration of love, she wasn't so naive as to expect that, but perhaps a deepening of the intellectual connection they had formed, a chance to know the man behind the ducal mask. It was this hope, however slender, that sustained her through the weeks of preparation and the long journey to Derbyshire in Elena's comfortable travelling carriage. "You're very quiet, my dear," Elena observed as they passed through the picturesque landscape of the Peak District. "Are you anxious about the house party?" Josephine turned from her contemplation of the passing scenery. "A little," she admitted. "I've never attended such a gathering before." "There's nothing to fear. You'll be under my protection, and I assure you my nephew runs a most civilized household. There will be the usual country pursuits, riding, shooting for the gentlemen, perhaps some amateur theatricals in the evenings, but nothing too taxing." "It's not the activities that concern me," Josephine said hesitantly. It's the purpose of the gathering." Elena's expression softened with understanding. "Ah, you've heard that James is seeking a wife. Miss Holloway mentioned it, yes. And this troubles you." Josephine looked down at her gloved hands, unable to meet the older woman's perceptive gaze. "It's not my place to be troubled by His Grace's personal decisions." "Perhaps not," Elena agreed, her tone gentle. "But feelings rarely confine themselves to their proper places, do they?" Josephine's head snapped up in alarm. Had she been so transparent? "Lady Rushworth, I assure you." "Elena," the older woman corrected firmly. "And there's no need for assurances, my dear. I have eyes. I've observed you both these past weeks. The question is, what do you intend to do about it?" "Do," Josephine echoed faintly. "There's nothing to be done. The Duke requires a suitable duchess, someone of appropriate rank and fortune, someone who can navigate the highest circles of society with confidence. I am none of those things." "You underestimate yourself," Elena said, "and perhaps you underestimate my nephew as well. James is not a conventional man, for all that he appears to be the very model of ducal propriety. His first engagement taught him the value of substance over show. Lady Caroline was everything a duchess should be on paper, beautiful, well-born, accomplished, and yet she brought him nothing but pain and public humiliation." Josephine hesitated, torn between curiosity and the impropriety of discussing such personal matters. "I've heard rumors, but you're too well-mannered to ask for details," Elena finished with a smile. "The truth is both simpler and more complicated than the gossips would have it. Caroline never loved James. She accepted his proposal because a duchess's coronet was too tempting to resist, but her heart belonged to Count Mazzini from the start. When the Count finally offered marriage instead of merely flirtation, she abandoned James without a backward glance, 2 weeks before the wedding, with the guests already arriving at Darrington Hall." "How terrible for him," Josephine murmured, her heart aching at the thought of James facing such public rejection. "It was a difficult time," Elena acknowledged. "James withdrew from society completely for nearly a year. When he returned, he was changed, more guarded, more skeptical of people's motivations. It's only recently that I've seen glimpses of the man he was before, curious, passionate about ideas, willing to engage with the world instead of merely observing it from behind his title." "And now he seeks a wife," Josephine said, unable to keep a note of wistfulness from her voice. "He seeks a partner," Elena corrected. "Someone who will support his work improving the estates, who will bring intelligence and compassion to the role of duchess, who will stand beside him rather than behind or in front of him." She reached across the carriage to pat Josephine's hand. "Don't dismiss possibilities before they've had a chance to manifest, my dear." Before Josephine could formulate a response, the carriage began to slow. Elena glanced out the window. "Ah, we're approaching the gates now. Prepare to be impressed, Josephine. Darrington Hall has been the seat of the Dukes of Darrington for over 3 centuries, and each generation has added to its splendor. As the carriage rounded a bend in the drive, Darrington Hall came into view, and Josephine gasped in genuine awe. The house was a magnificent example of Elizabethan architecture, its facade of golden stone glowing warmly in the late afternoon sunlight. Mullioned windows reflected the sky like hundreds of tiny mirrors, while intricately carved gables and chimneys created a dramatic silhouette against the backdrop of rolling hills. "It's beautiful," Josephine breathed. "Yes," Elena agreed with evident pride. "And it's more than just a grand house. It's the heart of a community. The estate employs hundreds of local people, supports the village school and infirmary, provides almshouses for the elderly. James takes these responsibilities very seriously." As the carriage drew up before the entrance, Josephine saw a line of servants assembled to greet them, with the Duke himself standing at the top of the steps. He came forward as the footman opened the carriage door, offering his hand first to his aunt, and then, with a slight bow, to Josephine. "Welcome to Darrington Hall, Miss Vance," he said, his deep voice sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. "I trust your journey was comfortable." "Most comfortable, thank you, Your Grace," Josephine replied, acutely conscious of the warmth of his gloved hand supporting hers as she descended from the carriage. "James," he reminded her, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "We are well beyond formalities now, I think." "James," she conceded, returning his smile hesitantly. For a moment they stood thus, hands still joined, gazes locked in silent communication. Then Elena cleared her throat delicately, and the spell was broken. "You must be tired from your journey," the Duke said, releasing her hand and stepping back. "Mrs. Winters, our housekeeper, will show you to your rooms. We dine at 8, but there's no need for elaborate dress tonight, just the family and a few early arrivals." As Josephine followed the housekeeper into the grand entrance hall, with its soaring ceiling and ancestral portraits, she felt a curious sense of stepping not just into a ducal residence, but into a new chapter of her own story, one whose ending she could not yet foresee, but which promised to change her in ways she could scarcely imagine. The house party at Darrington Hall unfolded like a meticulously choreographed ballet. Each day brought new activities: morning rides through the estate's extensive parklands, afternoon archery competitions or boat excursions on the lake, evening concerts and card games. Throughout it all, Josephine observed the intricate dance of courtship and ambition playing out among the guests. The eligible young ladies, 5 in total, each accompanied by at least one eager parent, circled the Duke like planets around a sun, vying for his attention with varying degrees of subtlety. Lady Amelia Worthington, a renowned beauty with a substantial dowry, employed direct tactics, placing herself constantly in his path and engaging him in conversation at every opportunity. Miss Penelope Howard, more reserved but equally determined, showcased her excellent horsemanship and knowledge of estate management. The others employed similar strategies, each emphasizing the qualities they believed would most appeal to a duke in search of a duchess. James, for his part, was unfailingly courteous to all, revealing no particular preference through word or deed. He fulfilled his duties as host with impeccable grace, ensuring that every guest's comfort was attended to, that conversation at dinner was stimulating without becoming controversial, that the daily activities offered something of interest to everyone. Only Josephine, who had studied him so carefully over the weeks of their acquaintance at Elena's salon, could detect the subtle signs of strain beneath his polished exterior. The slight tightening around his eyes as Lady Amelia monopolized yet another conversation, the momentary clench of his jaw when Lord Howard made pointed references to his daughter's connections among the highest circles of society. She found herself both participant and observer in this elaborate social ritual. As Elena's companion, she was included in all activities, but exempt from the pressures of the marriage market. She rode with the morning party, though not on the magnificent hunters provided for the principal guests. She joined the archery competition, though no one remarked on her surprisingly accurate aim. She contributed to the evening's entertainment by turning pages for the more accomplished pianists, though she was not invited to perform herself. It was a curious position, neither servant nor equal, present but not fully seen. Yet it afforded her unique insights into the workings of the house party and its inhabitants. It was during one such moment of observation, 3 days into the gathering, that Josephine made a discovery that altered her understanding of the Duke's intentions. She had retreated to the library after luncheon, ostensibly to select a volume for Elena, who was resting in her rooms. In truth, she sought a brief respite from the constant social interaction that left her, an introvert by nature, feeling drained and overstimulated. The library of Darrington Hall was everything Elena had promised, a magnificent two-story chamber lined with thousands of volumes, with comfortable reading nooks tucked between the bookshelves and large windows overlooking the formal gardens. It was, to Josephine's mind, the heart of the house, revealing more about its owners than any number of grand reception rooms or portrait galleries. She was examining a shelf of botanical works when she heard voices approaching from the adjoining study, the Duke's private domain, according to Mrs. Winters. Unwilling to be discovered alone in the library, which might appear presumptuous, Josephine retreated into one of the window alcoves, partially concealed by heavy velvet curtains. The connecting door opened, and the Duke entered, accompanied by his land steward, Mr. Harrison, a serious man in his 50s whom Josephine had met briefly on her first day. "The reports are most encouraging, Your Grace, Mr. Harrison was saying, spreading papers across a large table in the center of the room. "The new drainage system has already increased yields in the North Fields by nearly 15%, and the model cottages are proving both more economical to maintain and healthier for the tenants. Illness rates have decreased markedly since the families moved in." "Excellent," the Duke replied, studying the reports with evident satisfaction. "And the school?" "Attendance continues to improve. The addition of practical subjects, basic agriculture for the boys, household management for the girls, has been particularly well received. Parents see the value in education that prepares their children for the lives they'll lead." "And the lives they might lead," the Duke corrected. "I don't want our school merely to perpetuate the existing order. The brightest children should have opportunities beyond the estate, if they desire them." Mr. Harrison nodded, though Josephine thought she detected a hint of reservation in his expression. "As you say, Your Grace. Though it might be wise to manage expectations. Not every tenant's son can become a scholar or a merchant." "Perhaps not," James agreed, "but neither should they be denied the chance to try, simply because of the circumstances of their birth." He straightened, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "Thank you, Harrison. We'll discuss the new almshouses tomorrow after breakfast. I believe Lady Worthington has organized an excursion to the Roman ruins for the morning, which should keep our guests occupied." As the steward bowed and withdrew, the Duke remained at the table, a slight frown creasing his brow. Josephine, still hidden in the alcove, found herself holding her breath, afraid that the slightest movement might reveal her presence. To her horror, he moved not toward the study door, but to one of the bookshelves near her hiding place. As he scanned the titles, he spoke suddenly without turning. "You may come out now, Miss Vance. I assure you I don't bite." Josephine stepped from behind the curtain, mortified at being caught eavesdropping. "Your Grace, James, I apologize most sincerely. I was selecting a book for Lady Rushworth when I heard voices approaching, and I didn't wish to intrude." The Duke regarded her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, part amusement, part curiosity. "And yet you remained, hidden behind my curtains, listening to a private conversation with my steward." "I should have made my presence known immediately," Josephine admitted, her cheeks burning with shame. "There's no excuse for my behavior." "Perhaps there is," he suggested, leaning against the bookshelf with surprising casualness. "Perhaps the novelist in you couldn't resist the opportunity to observe undetected. Isn't that what you do, Miss Vance? Watch people when they think no one is looking, to understand what lies beneath the social masks we all wear." Josephine stared at him, startled by his insight. Yes, I suppose I do. But that doesn't justify invading your privacy." "No," he agreed, "it doesn't, but it does make it comprehensible." He gestured to the window seat. "Sit, please. Since you've already heard part of my conversation with Harrison, you might as well satisfy your curiosity about the rest." Hesitantly, Josephine took the offered seat, while the Duke settled himself in a leather chair opposite her. For a moment they regarded each other in silence, the air between them charged with an intensity that made Josephine's heart race. "You're implementing reforms on your estate," she said finally, deciding that directness was her best course. "Modern drainage systems, improved housing for tenants, education that goes beyond basic literacy." "I am," he confirmed. "Does that surprise you?" "No," she answered truthfully. "It aligns with the values you've expressed in our discussions at Elena's salon. You believe in progress, in improvement, in using privilege to benefit those with less fortunate circumstances. And you find this admirable." His tone was neutral, giving nothing away. "I find it consistent," Josephine replied carefully. "And yes, admirable. Many in your position would be content to collect rents and leave the management of their estates to others, with little thought for the welfare of those who depend upon them." Like Lady Amelia's father, perhaps, a hint of dry humour coloured his voice. "The Earl of Worthington is known for extracting every possible penny from his tenants while spending most of his time and income in London." "I wouldn't presume to criticize another peer," Josephine said diplomatically. The Duke laughed outright at this, a warm, genuine sound that transformed his austere features. "How very proper you can be when it suits you, Miss Vance. Yet I've heard you express decidedly improper opinions on everything from the Corn Laws to women's education in my aunt's salon." "That's different," she protested. "Lady Rushworth's salon is a space for the free exchange of ideas. This is your home, and I am merely a guest, and not even a guest of particular consequence." Something flickered in his eyes at this, a brief flash of what might have been anger or frustration. "You underestimate your consequence, Miss Vance." Before she could respond to this puzzling statement, he rose and moved to the bookshelf again, selecting a slim volume bound in green leather. "I believe you were looking for a book for my aunt. She enjoys Mrs. Gaskell's work. This new novel of hers might suit." Josephine accepted the book, recognizing the dismissal in his tone. She rose, curtsying slightly. "Thank you, Your Grace. And again, I apologize for the intrusion." "James," he corrected, the stern set of his features softening somewhat. "And perhaps it was not entirely unwelcome." With those enigmatic words hanging in the air between them, Josephine fled the library, her mind whirling with confusion and a dangerous, impossible hope. The following days brought new guests to Darrington Hall, the final arrivals for the house party, including the Marquis of Hereford and his wife, close friends of the Duke, Lady Catherine Winters, a widowed countess with a reputation for matchmaking, and most significantly, the Earl and Countess of Pembroke with their daughter, Lady Diana, widely considered the most eligible young woman of the season. Lady Diana was everything Josephine was not: tall, willowy, with hair like spun gold and eyes of cornflower blue. Her manners were impeccable, her accomplishments numerous, her dowry substantial, and her lineage impeccable. From the moment of her arrival, it was clear to all observers that she represented the ideal candidate for the position of Duchess of Darrington. The Duke's attention shifted noticeably after Lady Diana's appearance. He rode with her each morning, engaged her in conversation at dinner, and partnered with her during the impromptu dance arranged in the ballroom after a rainy day confined the party indoors. They made a striking couple, he dark and commanding, she fair and graceful, both possessed of the innate confidence that came from generations of privilege and power. Watching them together, Josephine felt a cold certainty settle in her heart. This was the natural order of things, a duke and an earl's daughter, perfectly matched in rank, wealth, and social standing. Her own brief moments of connection with James, the shared glances, the intellectual debates, the occasional instances when his guard seemed to lower in her presence, were nothing more than the courtesies extended by a well-bred gentleman to a lady under his roof. Yet even as she accepted this rational conclusion, she could not quite extinguish the flame of feeling that had grown within her. She found herself studying him still, the way his expression softened when he spoke of his plans for the estate, the gentleness with which he treated the elderly servants, the quiet moments when he escaped to the library and lost himself in books rather than socializing with his guests. It was during one such moment of observation, as she watched him walk the gardens with Lady Diana on his arm, that Elena found her. "They make a handsome couple, don't they?" the older woman remarked, following Josephine's gaze through the drawing-room window. "Very handsome," Josephine agreed, striving for a neutral tone. Lady Diana is everything a duchess should be. On paper, perhaps, Elena said thoughtfully, just as Caroline was. Josephine turned to her with a questioning look. Oh, I don't suggest that Diana harbors any secret Italian counts in her past, Elena clarified with a smile. She is by all accounts a lovely girl with impeccable character. But suitability isn't merely a matter of rank and connections, is it? There's the question of compatibility, of shared values and visions for the future. I'm sure the Duke has considered all these factors, Josephine said, unable to keep a note of wistfulness from her voice. He seems most attentive to Lady Diana. James is attentive to all his guests, Elena replied. It's what makes him such an excellent host. But have you noticed that he discusses estate improvements with Penelope Howard, rides with Amelia Worthington, plays chess with Lady Catherine's niece, and walks in the garden with Diana Pembroke? He is being scrupulously fair, giving each young lady equal opportunity to display her qualities. As any gentleman would in his position, Josephine pointed out. Perhaps, Elena conceded, but tell me this. With whom does he discuss books, philosophy, the moral questions that trouble his conscience when he must balance tradition against progress? Josephine hesitated, caught off guard by the question. I don't know. Don't you? Elena's gaze was penetrating. In the 3 weeks since the house party began, have you not noticed that he seeks you out in the library, in the conservatory, in the quiet corners where substantive conversation is possible? That he brings you new publications he thinks might interest you, that he asks your opinion on matters ranging from tenant education to the latest political debates in Parliament. It was true, Josephine realized with a start. Amid the swirl of social activities and formal engagements, James had created small pockets of time for the kind of intellectual exchange they had enjoyed in London. She had attributed these moments to courtesy, to his recognition of her position as his aunt's companion, perhaps even to pity for her obvious outsider status among the glittering guests. He is kind, she said at last. But kindness doesn't signify anything deeper. Doesn't it? Elena smiled enigmatically. My nephew is a complex man, Josephine. Don't mistake his public performance for his private inclinations. Before Josephine could press for clarification, a footman approached with a message for Elena, and the moment passed. But the older woman's words lingered in her thoughts, a dangerous ember of hope that refused to be extinguished despite all rational attempts to smother it. That evening, as the house party gathered in the music room for an informal concert, Josephine found herself seated somewhat apart from the main group, near a tall window that overlooked the moonlit gardens. She had assisted Elena in arranging the entertainment, ensuring that each young lady who wished to display her musical talents had the opportunity to do so, and now she was content to observe the proceedings from a discreet distance. Lady Diana was at the pianoforte, her slender fingers moving gracefully over the keys as she performed a Chopin nocturne with technical precision, if not particular emotional depth. The Duke stood nearby, turning pages for her with perfect timing, his expression one of polite appreciation. She plays well, a voice murmured close to Josephine's ear, causing her to start slightly. She turned to find James himself beside her, though she could have sworn he had been across the room only moments before. Your Grace, I thought. That I was attending Lady Diana, he smiled faintly. I was, now I am here. The piece concluded, and Miss Howard has taken my place as page dinner for the next selection. Indeed, Penelope Howard now stood where the Duke had been, while Lady Diana began a lively Scottish air. You move silently for such a large man, Josephine observed, then immediately coloured at the impropriety of the remark, but James merely chuckled, settling into the chair beside hers, a useful skill acquired in childhood. My father had little tolerance for childish noise, so my brother and I learned to navigate the house like ghosts. The casual reference to his childhood, something he rarely mentioned, caught Josephine's attention. Was he very stern, your father? Terrifying, James said matter-of-factly. A duke of the old school, who believed that children should be neither seen nor heard unless summoned for inspection. My brother Philip rebelled, loudly and frequently. I chose a different strategy. Observation and adaptation, Josephine suggested, remembering his comment in the library. Precisely. He glanced at her with approval. You understand because you employ the same technique, though for different reasons. The wallflower's defense becomes so still and quiet that you blend into the background, free to watch and learn without drawing unwanted attention. Josephine nodded slowly, struck by his insight. It's effective most of the time, until someone notices that the wallflower has the most perceptive eyes in the room, he said softly. And then one cannot help but wonder what those eyes have seen, what judgments they have formed, what stories they have crafted from their observations. There was something in his tone, a warmth and intensity that made Josephine's heart beat faster. She struggled to maintain the light, conversational tone their exchange had begun with. My observations are hardly significant, Your Grace. James, he corrected automatically, and I disagree. Your observations, as expressed in your stories and essays, reveal more understanding of human nature than many who have lived twice your years. He leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. Tell me, what have you observed of our gathering these past weeks? What story would you write of Darrington Hall's house party? It was a dangerous question, inviting honesty in a setting that demanded diplomacy. Josephine hesitated, weighing her words carefully. I would write of a gathering where nothing is quite what it appears, she said finally, where young ladies perform the role of potential duchess while calculating the advantages of the position, where parents advance their daughters like pieces on a chessboard, seeking the ultimate check and mate, where a duke observes it all with outward composure but inward reservation. Reservation, he raised an eyebrow. An interesting choice of word, not reluctance, not distaste. No, Josephine said thoughtfully. You are not reluctant to marry again, nor do you appear to find the process distasteful. You are evaluating with care and deliberation, as you would any important decision affecting your estates and title. But there is a reserve, a part of yourself that you hold back, that remains untouched by the social rituals being enacted around you. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable in the candlelit room. Then, with a slight inclination of his head, he acknowledged the accuracy of her assessment. You see more than most, Josephine Vance. The use of her full name, spoken in his deep voice with such quiet intensity, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. Is that a compliment or a warning? She asked, attempting to lighten the moment. Perhaps both, he replied, his expression softening into something close to a genuine smile. Tell me, what ending would you write for this story you're observing? Does the Duke select the most appropriate bride from among the assembled candidates? Does he fulfill his duty to his title and lineage by making the sensible, expected choice? Josephine swallowed hard, aware that they were no longer speaking of a hypothetical story. I don't know, she admitted. The ending depends on what the Duke truly values, what he seeks in a marriage beyond the obvious advantages of alliance and continuation of his line. And if what he values most is authenticity, James asked, his gaze never leaving her face. Intelligence, the courage to speak truth even when it's unwelcome, the ability to see beyond titles and position to the person beneath. Josephine's breath caught in her throat. Surely he couldn't be suggesting. Before she could formulate a response, Lady Catherine approached, effectively ending their private conversation. Your Grace, the Countess said with a knowing smile, you mustn't monopolize Miss Vance's attention. Lady Pembroke has been asking after you. I believe she wishes to discuss the arrangements for tomorrow's theatrical entertainment. James rose with fluid grace, inclining his head politely to both ladies. Of course. Thank you for the reminder, Lady Catherine. Miss Vance, our conversation has been most illuminating. As he moved away to join the Pembrokes, Josephine remained where she was, her mind whirling with confusion and hope. Had she misinterpreted his words? Was she reading intention where there was merely courteous conversation? Or had the Duke of Darrington, in his subtle, guarded way, been suggesting that his criteria for a duchess might not be what society expected, might, in fact, encompass qualities that she herself possessed? Lady Catherine settled into the chair James had vacated, her shrewd gaze assessing Josephine with undisguised interest. You've made quite an impression on our Duke, my dear. Josephine composed her features into a mask of polite surprise. "I'm sure you're mistaken, Lady Catherine. His Grace is merely kind to all his guests." "Is that what you believe?" The Countess chuckled softly. "How charmingly modest. But I've known James Darrington since he was in short coats, Miss Vance. I recognize the signs when he finds someone intriguing." Uncertain how to respond to this direct approach, Josephine remained silent. Lady Catherine leaned closer, lowering her voice. "A word of advice from one who wishes him well. James has been hurt before by a woman who saw only his title and fortune. If you harbor genuine feelings for the man behind the dukedom, don't allow fear or convention to silence them. He values honesty above all other virtues." Before Josephine could recover from her shock at this extraordinary statement, Lady Catherine rose and drifted away, leaving her alone with thoughts as tumultuous as a storm-tossed sea. The days that followed were a confusing blend of hope and doubt for Josephine. James continued to divide his attentions among his female guests, dancing with Lady Diana at the small ball held in honor of the Marquis of Hereford's birthday, riding with Miss Howard in the crisp autumn mornings, engaged in conversation with Lady Amelia during afternoon tea. Yet there were moments, brief, private moments, when he sought Josephine's company with a deliberateness that could not be mistaken. He found her in the conservatory one morning, sketching exotic plants for Alina's botanical collection, and spent an hour discussing his travels in the Mediterranean. He appeared beside her during an archery competition, offering quiet suggestions for improving her aim that resulted in a surprising victory over the more experienced Lady Diana. Most tellingly, he invited her to catalogue a collection of rare manuscripts recently acquired for the library, a task that required them to work side by side for several afternoons, their heads bent close over delicate parchments, their conversations ranging from medieval history to contemporary literature. Throughout these encounters, Josephine felt a growing certainty that James saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else ever had. Not as a wallflower, a spinster, or a burden on her family's resources, but as a woman of intelligence and substance, whose mind was worthy of engagement, whose opinions merited consideration. Yet she could not quite bring herself to believe that this regard might extend beyond intellectual appreciation to something deeper, more personal. The gap between their stations remained an insurmountable barrier in her mind, reinforced by every social interaction that emphasized his position and her relative insignificance. This internal conflict reached its peak on the evening of the theatrical entertainment, an elaborate production of scenes from Shakespeare arranged by Lady Pembroke, with the younger guests taking various roles. Josephine, naturally, had not been cast, but she had assisted with costumes and scenery, finding unexpected pleasure in the creative work. The performance was to be held in the small theatre that had been added to Darrington Hall during the previous century, a charming space with a proper stage, velvet-upholstered seating for 50 guests, and excellent acoustics. As the audience assembled, Josephine slipped into a seat at the back, content to observe the fruits of everyone's efforts from a discreet distance. She was surprised when, moments before the performance was to begin, James appeared beside her rather than taking his reserved seat in the front row. "Your Grace," she whispered, conscious of the curious glances directed their way, "shouldn't you be seated with your honored guests?" "I've had quite enough of being on display these past weeks," he replied quietly, settling beside her with a sigh that spoke volumes about his state of mind. "Besides, the view is better from here. One can see both the performance and the audience's reactions." Josephine couldn't argue with this logic. It aligned perfectly with her own preference for observation over participation. Still, she felt acutely aware of the statement his choice made. By sitting beside her publicly when he should have been front and center as host, he was signaling something. She wasn't entirely certain what. As the lights dimmed and the performance began, a selection from A Midsummer Night's Dream, with Lady Diana as a luminous Titania, Josephine found herself more conscious of James's presence beside her than of the action on stage. The warmth of his arm occasionally brushing hers, the subtle scent of his cologne, the sound of his quiet laughter at particularly well-delivered lines, these sensations overwhelmed her awareness, making it impossible to focus on the play. During the brief intermission between scenes, He leaned close to whisper an observation about Lady Amelia's surprisingly effective portrayal of Puck. His breath against her ear sent a shiver down Josephine's spine, a reaction he could not have failed to notice, given their proximity. Indeed, when she darted a glance at his face, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. For a breathless moment, it seemed as though he might say something significant, something that would clarify the growing tension between them. But the lights dimmed again for the second act, and the moment passed, leaving Josephine in a state of exquisite uncertainty. After the performance concluded, to enthusiastic applause from the indulgent audience, the party adjourned to the grand salon for refreshments and congratulations to the amateur actors. Josephine hung back, helping Elena to her feet and ensuring she had her cane before following the crowd. By the time they reached the salon, James was surrounded by guests, with Lady Diana at his side looking flushed and triumphant after her successful performance. The Earl of Pembroke stood nearby, his expression one of paternal satisfaction as he observed his daughter commanding the Duke's attention. "A successful evening," Elena remarked, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing footman. "The Pembrokes must be pleased." Josephine nodded, her throat suddenly too tight for speech. Watching James with Lady Diana, both of them so perfectly matched in appearance and station, she felt the full force of her own presumption. Whatever moments of connection she had shared with the Duke, whatever hints of personal interest he might have shown, the reality of their situations remained unchanged. He was a duke with responsibilities to his title and estates. She was a penniless gentlewoman with nothing to offer but her mind and heart. "I believe I'll retire early," she said to Elena, summoning a smile that felt brittle on her lips. "The preparations for the theatricals were more tiring than I expected." Elena gave her a searching look but didn't press. "Of course, my dear. Shall I have some tea sent up to your room?" "Thank you, but no. I simply need rest." Josephine squeezed the older woman's hand affectionately. "Good night, Elena." As she slipped from the salon, Josephine felt James's gaze follow her, but she didn't turn back. Whatever his feelings might be, the path before him was clear. Society, duty, and common sense all pointed toward Lady Diana or one of the other suitable young ladies. A duke did not marry a wallflower, no matter how intriguing he might find her mind. In her room, Josephine changed into her nightgown with the assistance of Elena's maid, then dismissed the girl and sat at the small writing desk by the window. Outside, the gardens of Darrington Hall lay silvered in moonlight, the formal parterres and stone fountains transformed into something magical and otherworldly. She drew out her notebook, the constant companion that had accompanied her through years of observation and imagination, and began to write. Not a story this time, but a letter she knew she would never send, addressed to a man she could never have. "Dear James, I write these words knowing they will never reach you, which perhaps gives me the courage to be more honest than I could ever be in person. These past weeks at Darrington Hall have been both the happiest and the most painful of my life. Happy because I have come to know you, not just the Duke of Darrington, but James, the man who cares deeply for his tenants, who loves books almost as much as I do, who laughs rarely but with genuine warmth when he does. Painful because each day brings the knowledge that our paths must inevitably diverge. You will marry a woman worthy of your position, someone like Lady Diana, who will grace your home and title with beauty and accomplishment. It is right that you should. The Duke cannot follow his heart if duty points elsewhere. But I want you to know that someone saw you, truly saw you, beyond the title and fortune that so many covet. I saw your kindness to those who cannot benefit you, your passion for improving the lives of those dependent on you, your hunger for ideas and conversation that goes beyond social pleasantries. I saw you, James. And in seeing you, I committed the unforgivable error of giving you my heart. I do not write this expecting or hoping for anything. By the time you read these words, if indeed you ever do, I will be gone from Darrington Hall, return to my quiet life in London, where I shall treasure the memory of these weeks as one treasures a precious dream upon waking. I wish you every happiness with your chosen duchess. Know that somewhere in London, a wallflower will be dreaming of the brief, bright moments when a duke saw past her unremarkable exterior to the soul beneath. With deepest affection, Josephine. She stared at the words she had written, tears blurring her vision. Then, with deliberate movements, she folded the letter and sealed it with wax, using the small seal that had been her grandmother's. Tomorrow she would burn it, erasing this moment of weakness and vulnerability. But for tonight, she allowed herself the luxury of having spoken her heart, if only to the silent paper. A soft knock at her door startled her from her melancholy reverie. Hastily wiping away her tears, she rose to answer it, expecting Elena's maid with some forgotten item or message. Instead, she found James himself standing in the corridor, still in his evening attire, but with his cravat slightly loosened, as though he had been about to retire when seized by some urgent thought. "Your Grace," Josephine exclaimed, acutely conscious of her state of undress, her hair loose about her shoulders, her feet bare beneath her modest nightgown. "Is something wrong? Is Lady Rushworth unwell?" "My aunt is perfectly fine," he said, his gaze taking in her appearance with an intensity that made her flush. "May I come in? I need to speak with you." The impropriety of such a request was staggering. A gentleman entering a lady's bedchamber at night, without chaperone or servants present, it was the stuff of ruination. "That would be most inappropriate," Josephine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps tomorrow, in one of the public rooms." "I've spent weeks adhering to propriety," James interrupted, a note of frustration entering his voice. "Weeks maintaining a careful distance, weeks ensuring that not even a hint of gossip could attach to your name. But tonight, I can no longer pretend that what I feel for you is merely intellectual admiration or friendly regard." Josephine's heart seemed to stop, then resume beating at twice its normal pace. "What? What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you, Josephine Vance." The words emerged with the force of long restraint finally broken. "I love your mind, your perception, your quiet strength. I love the way you see beyond surfaces to essences. I love that you challenge my thinking and expand my understanding. I love that you value substance over show, authenticity over advantage." Josephine stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "But Lady Diana, everyone expects me to make a suitable match, to choose a wife based on rank, fortune, and social accomplishment." James stepped closer, not quite crossing the threshold, but near enough that she could see the emotion burning in his dark eyes. "But I tried that path once before, and it led only to public humiliation and private misery. This time, I intend to marry for love as well as respect. This time, I choose the woman who sees me as a man, not merely a title." I can't be a duchess," Josephine protested weakly, even as hope bloomed within her like a flower turning toward the sun. "I have no fortune, no connections, no training for such a position." "You have intelligence, compassion, and moral courage," he countered. "The rest can be learned. And as for fortune, I have more than enough for both of us. What I lack is a partner who understands my vision for the future, who will support my efforts to improve the lives of those dependent on the dukedom, who will challenge me when I'm wrong and strengthen me when I falter." He held out his hand, palm up, an invitation, not a demand. "Will you be that partner, Josephine? Will you marry me not because I'm a duke, but despite it?" Josephine looked at the outstretched hand, then at the face of the man offering it, the man who had seen past her carefully constructed invisibility to the woman beneath. In his eyes she read sincerity, determination, and a vulnerability that matched her own. With trembling fingers, she reached for the letter she had written, breaking the seal to hand it to him. "Read this," she said softly. "Then ask me again." James accepted the paper with a questioning look, then unfolded it and began to read. As his eyes moved across her heartfelt confession, his expression softened, a smile spreading slowly across his features, not the restrained, polite smile he showed to society, but something warmer, more genuine. When he finished, he looked up, his eyes shining with emotion. "It seems we have been harboring the same secret, each believing it impossible to speak aloud." "It still seems impossible," Josephine admitted. "The scandal will be tremendous. Your peers will say you've lost your mind. My family will be accused of somehow engineering this match. Lady Diana and the others will feel deceived." "Let them talk," James said firmly. "I've spent my life conforming to expectations, placing duty above personal happiness. But what duty am I serving by making myself miserable? How will that benefit my estates or my tenants? A duke with a partner who strengthens and supports him will be far more effective than one trapped in a loveless marriage of convenience. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold at last, and took her hands in his. Marry me, Josephine. Be my duchess, my partner, my love. Say yes. In that moment, all Josephine's doubts and fears seemed to melt away. The path before her might be challenging, but she would not walk it alone. With James beside her, James who saw her, valued her, loved her, she could face whatever trials lay ahead. Yes, she whispered, her heart too full for elaborate declarations. Yes, I will marry you. As his lips met hers in a kiss that spoke of promise and passion long restrained, Josephine felt the last vestiges of her old self, the wallflower, the invisible observer, fall away. In its place emerged a woman who dared not only to dream, but to reach for those dreams with both hands. The scandal, when it broke, was indeed tremendous. The Duke of Darrington's engagement to Miss Josephine Vance, a genteel nobody with no fortune and no connections of note, was the talk of London for weeks. Speculations ranged from the romantic, a love match against all odds, to the cynical, she must be with child, to the bizarre, she had entrapped him through witchcraft or mesmerism. Through it all, James remained steadfast, facing down the disapproval of his peers with the same quiet determination he brought to all his convictions. Josephine, for her part, discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed, meeting the curious stares and whispered comments of society with a dignity that gradually earned respect, if not universal approval. Elena, of course, was their staunchest ally, declaring publicly that she had never seen a couple better suited, and privately confessing to Josephine that she had hoped for precisely this outcome from the moment she invited her to the house party. They were married in the chapel at Darrington Hall on a crisp autumn day, with a small gathering of those who truly wished them well. Elena, Josephine's family, who had moved from shock to cautious delight at their daughter's incredible good fortune, and the salon friends who had first witnessed the meeting of their minds. As Josephine walked down the aisle toward James, radiant in a gown of ivory silk that Elena had insisted on commissioning from London's finest modiste, she thought of how far she had come from the wallflower who had stood against the ballroom wall, invisible and overlooked. She was still the same woman at heart, observant, thoughtful, more comfortable with books than ballrooms, but now she was seen and loved not despite her differences but because of them. And as she spoke her vows to the man who had looked beyond her unremarkable exterior to the light within, she silently vowed something else as well, that she would use her unexpected position to ensure that other overlooked women, other quiet observers with rich inner lives, would find their voices and their value in a world too often dazzled by surface shine. The wallflower had indeed become a duchess, but more importantly, she had become herself, fully and without apology. And in that transformation lay not just her own happiness, but the promise of change that would ripple outward, touching countless lives in ways she had only begun to imagine.